You packed the box the night before. That is the tell. Nobody packs a box in August. You just grab whatever is already tied on from last time. But the first cool night comes through, and something changes. You sort the topwater tray. You put the buzzbait on top where you can reach it without looking. You set an alarm early for no reason other than the air on the porch finally felt like fall. And the morning delivers. 58 degrees at the ramp, fog sitting low and flat on the water, that first breath that actually has an edge to it. Everything you know about September says the fish should be up, moving, feeding, and mean. 4 hours later, you have one short strike and a sunburn, and the conversation on the ride home is always the same conversation. Wrong bait, wrong color, wrong lake. I have watched anglers have that exact conversation for years, and it is almost never about the bait. Here are the 5 baits that belong in a September box. I am not going to argue with a single one of them. A bladed jig, a compact creature bait for flipping and pitching, a finesse worm on a Neko rig, the little urchin-style stuff everybody is throwing right now, a buzzbait, and a plopper-style topwater, the kind with the churning tail. That is a good list. That is the list you have already seen a dozen times this month, and the people making it are not lying to you. So I am keeping all 5. What I want to change is the rule for when you pick each one up. Because a calendar list tells you what to buy, it does not tell you what is happening under your boat this morning. And those two things drift apart every single fall. Here is the line I want you to carry into the rest of this video. The air says September. The lake may still say August. A cool front cools the air in a few hours. It barely touches a reservoir. There is 100 and something feet of water down there with an entire summer stored in it, and one crisp morning does not move that number. So the angler wakes up in fall. The lake wakes up in late summer, and the bait that was going to be perfect is perfect in about 11 days. Which brings me to the only thing I actually want you to memorize today. 3 words, in order. Floquet, temperature, current, bait. Before I blame the bait, I want 3 answers. Is the water actually changing yet? Is the water moving? And where is the forage? 3 questions you can answer from the bank, from a kayak, or from the front deck in under 5 minutes, using nothing you do not already own. And every one of those 5 baits gets switched on by a different combination of those 3 answers. Not by a date, by an answer. Start with temperature, and start with the honest version, because this is where most September advice goes sideways. You do not need to find your thermocline. You are not going to find it accurately with a pool thermometer on a string, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling you confidence. Water sitting on a thermometer starts changing temperature the second you begin reeling it back up. What you get is a rough profile at best. What you actually need is cheaper than that. You need the trend. Is your surface temperature lower than it was 3 days ago, or is it the same number it has been since the 2nd week of August? Because that is the real trigger. Not one cold front. Nights getting long enough that the lake loses more heat overnight than the sun puts back the next day. On most water that is a 2-week process, and it starts on a different date every single year. So write the number down. That is the whole assignment. Surface temperature, every trip, in the Notes app on your phone. 3 trips in, and you stop guessing what season your lake is in, because now you can read it. And here is the so what. If that number has not moved in 2 weeks, fish your summer places with your fall enthusiasm. Shade, depth changes, current, and cover. If it has dropped 4 or 5 degrees and it keeps dropping, now you start running bank. And now that topwater window stretches past the first hour instead of closing with the fog. Second question, is the water moving? This is the part I think most anglers underuse, and it costs nothing at all. If you fish below a dam, on a tailwater, on a controlled river, or on a reservoir that gets drawn down in the fall, somebody has already decided what your water is going to do today. And a lot of the time they publish it. The Geological Survey runs a public dashboard carrying real-time data from more than 13,000 monitoring stations nationwide. Stream flow, lake and reservoir levels, and at some of those sites, water temperature. Not every station has a temperature reading, but everyone that does is handing you for free the number you were about to guess at. Down in the Tennessee Valley, The authority publishes reservoir levels and operating information for its system. And for many Corps of Engineers projects, the federal agency that markets the hydropower posts a current-day generation schedule. In the Mid-South, that is Southwestern Power Administration, and they will read you the schedule over the phone if you would rather call than click. Before you buy another topwater, find out whether somebody is about to turn the river on. Here is what that changes on the water. Generation starts, flow picks up, bait fish quit holding wherever they were, and stack on the current seams and the downstream edges of every piece of hard cover in that river. Bass slide up and set the ambush, because now the food is being delivered to them. And inside that window, your casting angle matters more than your bait color. Throw up current and bring it back with the flow, so the bait arrives the way real food arrives. Anglers working across the seam get bit. Anglers dragging against it usually do not. That is a free adjustment. Nobody has to sell you a rod for that one. Third question, where is the bait? Not what species, just where. Spend 30 seconds looking before you tie anything on, because September is when the forage moves and takes the bass with it. Look at the backs of the pockets. Look for nervous water on a flat at first light. Look for shad flicking along a shade line at 10 in the morning. Look for bluegill hanging around the last green grass, because in a lot of lakes the vegetation is starting to thin, and the patches still holding are worth more now than they were in July. And size tells you more than color here. If everything flicking on the surface is 2 inches long, that is information. If you watch a wad of 4-inch shad get pushed against a bluff wall, that is a different piece of information entirely. So what? Match the profile before you match the paint job. That decision costs nothing, and it is the one people skip. Now the 5. Same 4 questions for each. When does it turn on? Where do you throw it? How do you fish it? And when do you put it down? The bladed jig turns on when you need to cover water and there is bait, grass, or current to cover it around. It is your search tool in September, and it is a very good one. Where? Grass edges, the last standing vegetation, creek channel swings, current seams below a shoal, and any flat where you saw something happen at first light. How? Faster than you think while the water is still warm, slower once that number starts dropping. And your free adjustment here is the trailer. A bulky trailer with paddle appendages makes the whole bait hunt wider, run slower, and hold higher in the column. A slim, tight trailer lets you burn it. Same head, same blade, completely different lure. The other free adjustment is contact. Do not swim it over the grass. Swim it into the grass, load the rod, and rip it free. That deflection is the bite 9 times out of 10. Put it down when you have run a stretch clean twice with no follows and no blow-ups. That is not a color problem. That is a fish that will not chase yet. Second bait, the compact creature, flipped and pitched. I want to be careful here, because you will hear people say, this bait looks like a bluegill. Honestly, it does not look like much of anything. That is its entire advantage, and calling it an imitation misses the point. What it actually gives you is a small package that falls straight down, penetrates cover, and does almost nothing on the way. No thumping, no kicking, no signal being broadcast. In water where fish have had all summer to watch things swim past them, a quiet vertical fall is a genuinely different proposition. Where? Laydowns, dock posts, bushes, matted grass, riprap seams, anywhere you can put a bait in a 5-inch window instead of a 5-foot window. How? Pick the target before you pick up the rod. Every flip should be aimed at something specific, and let it fall on a slack line, because a tight line swings that bait right back out of the cover you just spent a cast getting into. Put it down when you start getting bit on the first drop consistently, because that means those fish are active enough for something faster, and faster means more fish per hour. Third bait, the finesse worm on a Neko rig, the urchin-style stuff. I am not going to tell you it works everywhere. I have watched enough hype cycles to know how that sentence ages. What I will tell you is what it is actually for. It is your downshift. Reaction bait pulls a fish up, the fish follows it, the fish turns and eases back down. That fish is not gone. That fish is uncommitted. And that is the exact moment this rig earns its slot in the box. There is real work behind why September fish do that. Researchers have raised largemouth in ponds and then fished them with standard tackle to watch how catch rates change over time. Bass that came from heavily fished waters learned to avoid lures faster than bass from waters nobody fished. Other work has found that the individual fish that learn quickest in a lab are also the ones most likely to end up on an angler's hook first. I want to be careful about how far that stretches. That is pond and lab work, and September is not universally the peak of fishing pressure everywhere in America. But on water that gets hammered, pressure has had an entire season to pile up by now. The easy fish are already gone. What is left has seen things. So what? When the reaction bite fades, do not change color, change commitment level. Drop to something small, let it sit, and give it a slow twitch and a long pause. And understand that the pause is doing the work, not the twitch. Fourth bait, and this one deserves more credit than it usually gets. The buzzbait turns on when you need a topwater in a place a topwater has no business being. That is the whole argument. Cover, current, and sparse grass. A buzzbait is functionally weedless. It plows across a grass mat and pops out the other side. It will skip up under a dock or an overhanging limb and start planing before it has traveled a foot. Nothing else on this list does all three of those things. Where riprap and current seams on rivers, sparse grass where you can bring it over the top and drop it into the hole, and every overhanging limb you have been avoiding all summer because you did not want to lose a bait. How? And this is the part worth your attention. Every buzzbait has a minimum speed it needs to stay on the surface, and almost every buzzbait can be slowed below the speed you think it needs. Bend the arm slightly closer to the blade. Add a bulkier trailer for lift. Hold your rod tip high and start reeling before it lands. Now you can crawl that bait through a strike zone instead of racing it through. A bait that stays in the strike zone twice as long gets looked at twice as long. That is not a theory, that is arithmetic. Put it down in open water with nothing to run it against. Which brings us to the fifth one. The plopper-style topwater is a calling bait. That is what it does better than anything else here. Open flats, long shade lines, roaming bait, main lake points, and bass that are not sitting on one specific piece of cover but cruising and hunting. It puts out a wide sound signature, and it will draw a fish from farther away than a buzzbait will. How? Steady is fine, but the best adjustment is to kill it for 1 full second every time it crosses something. A shade line, a stump, a depth change. That hesitation is what turns a follow into a blow-up. And here is your decision rule for these two. I would write it on the lid of the box. Cover, current, or weedless access. Buzzbait. Open water, searching, calling a fish in from a distance. Plopper. Not absolute. There are days the fish argue with that, but if you are standing there with both rods on the deck and no information, that rule will be right far more often than a coin flip, and a lot more often than the calendar. Quick correction, and then I will let it go. You will hear that chartreuse and gold work in fall because the low sun lets a different part of the spectrum through the water. That explanation does not hold up. When the sun sits lower, light travels a longer path through the water, and the reds and golds get absorbed more, not less. But here is the interesting part. An angler's observation can be correct even when the explanation behind it is wrong. Bass have dichromatic vision, built around green-sensitive and red-sensitive cones. Their color world is not our color world, and a chartreuse and a white may look far more alike to them than they ever will to us. So chase contrast instead of wavelength. Clarity, silhouette, whether the bait shows up against the background, and what the bites are actually telling you. That is the version that survives contact with the water. Which brings me to the thing I would most like you to steal from this video. Before you change lures, change one free variable. Retrieve speed, not a little. Cut it in half, or double it, and give it 5 casts before you judge it. Casting angle. Same stretch of bank, different direction. Parallel instead of perpendicular. Up current instead of across. The bait arrives from a different place and reads as a different animal. And time. Shade moves. A bank sitting in full sun at 9 o'clock is in shade at 11, and that is a completely different piece of water with the exact same bait in it. 3 adjustments, $0. You can run all 3 before you ever open the second tackle tray, and most of the time, one of them is the answer. Here is where I will probably lose a few of you, and that is fine. The comments are for that. A cool September morning can fool an angler faster than it fools a reservoir. That crisp air changes how you feel, how you drive, what you tie on, and how long you give a spot before you leave it. It changes almost nothing about a body of water carrying an entire summer of stored heat, and I think more September trips get lost in that gap than to any bait choice anybody has ever made. Tell me if I am wrong. You have watched your water do this for years. 2 quick things before I let you go. September water is still warm water across most of the country, so treat a released fish like it is running on a short clock. Unhook it in the water when you can, keep air exposure short, and hold it upright until it swims off under its own power. And check your state and local regulations. Trailer hooks, blade counts, and what is legal on any given piece of water genuinely differ from state to state, and they do change. Now back to that morning. Same ramp, same cool air, same box you packed the night before. Only this time you do not open it first. You look at the water. You find out whether anybody is about to turn the river on. You watch a shade line for 30 seconds to see what is living in it. And then you open the box. Same 5 baits. Better questions. That is the whole thing. You do not need a new lure this fall. You need 3 answers before your first cast. Temperature, current, bait. Go get after it. And when you figure out the week your lake actually turns over, come back and tell me. I want to know.